make sure your phones are turned off. Can you hear me, Janet? Can you hear me now? Oh, good. Welcome everyone to the 2023 Congregational Lecture. It's lovely to see you all here. I think it's one of the first times we've held a lecture outside London, although we did have an online lecture during COVID, didn't we? So this is the first time we physically met for our congregational lecture outside London. And as I said earlier, for those who weren't here, the next lecture will be given by Alex Walsham. And next year on the 21st, Thursday the 21st of November, either Cambridge or London. Tonight we welcome our lecturer, Dr. Michael Davies. Michael is well known to us here at Bunyan Meeting. I'm not sure how many years ago it was since we first met, but Michael has worked here on our collection. He's also lectured here previously last year on the 22nd of October when we had a Bunyan Studies Day and various lectures came, and Michael started off our day with his lecture when he spoke about the Great Storm in Bedford, a pamphlet that was published in 1672, when the church was just settling here on this side. So I always think Michael is a great friend and supporter of Bunyan Meeting, but more than that, a wonderful Bunyan scholar. Michael teaches at the University of Liverpool. He teaches on early modern English literature. He's explored the theme of theology and narrative in the writings of John Bunyan and looked more generally at dissenting life in some of his research. As I say, he's worked here on various items in our collection, but more particularly on the church book, the very first church book of the church here. And that's been published on two occasions, once in 1928 by, was it Dents?
Yeah.
And then the Bedfordshire Historic Records Society produced another edition. But the definitive edition is going to be the one that's coming out sometime in the not too distant future, which Oxford University Press will be publishing for Michael. And so we look forward to that. I've kept saying this for several years, and I said to Michael tonight, have you got a date yet? And he said, near future. So we look forward to that. But there are several published works on Bunyan which Michael has had a hand in. He was one of the joint editors of the Oxford Handbook of John Bunyan. And then during lockdown, I went into town and picked up a book I saw reviewed either in the Cong History Society magazine or that sort of thing, called Church Life, which was a wonderful collection of essays on church life and dissenting churches. There's a chapter there written by Michael on Ebenezer Chandler and the Bedford Church, Bunyan's successor, I mentioned earlier, with the powdered wig, and 1689 to 1710. And then we also talked about the Fenn brothers, John and Samuel Fenn. Michael has published an article on those two brothers in Bunyan Studies. And tonight, Michael is speaking to us on John Bunyan, a congregational person. Michael, thank you for coming to give this year's congregational lecture, and we do look forward very much to what you have to say to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I begin, can everyone hear me? Yes. Even at the back? Are we okay? Before I begin, just a word of thanks, first of all, to Chris for the invitation. I'm fully aware of how prestigious this lecture is. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here, but I hope to do do my duty by the lecture. So thank you to Chris. Thank you to Dr. James for preparing the director's cut of this lecture, which is much longer than this will be, for publication or for the in lecture form. And I should also just mention a couple of colleagues with whom I've worked over the past few years, including Anne Dunan and Joel Halcombe, scholars in the same area of dissenting history. And we worked on a project called the Dissenting Experience Project. And in many ways, it's working on that project that has helped me find a way through the complex issues that I'm going to be addressing today. John Bunyan, congregational person. On the 6th of October, 1672, John Bunyan, here he is, John Bunyan found himself in what must have seemed an all too familiar situation. That is, brought before a panel of important local dignitaries, all bearing the superior title Mr. or Master, demanding to know what right he, Bunyan, had to preach the word of God in their town. The differences between this occasion and that of his arrest and imprisonment in November 1660, 12 years earlier, are important for us to note. In October 1672, John Bunyan was no longer a prisoner. He had been released in the wake of King Charles II's Declaration of Indulgence, issued on the 15th of March that year. Under the terms of this indulgence, which suspended penal laws against Protestant nonconformists and Roman Catholics, Bunyan applied for and received a license to preach, issued on the 9th of May, and a pardon was granted officially on the 13th of September 1672. A month later, a few weeks later, he was in Leicester. He was not in his hometown here in Bedford then. And although his Leicester connections remain uncertain, Bunyan's right to preach there was no longer in doubt, for it rested now on something much more material than the arguments he presented to hostile justices who interrogated him during his initial incarceration in 1660 to 1661. In Leicester, in October 1672, Bunyan required no words to justify his calling as a preacher. Like his famous pilgrim, all he had to do was produce from his bosom a certificate, his license to teach, issued by His Majesty the King, which the said Bunyan showed to Mr. Mayor, Mr. Overing, Mr. Freeman and Mr. Brown, all of the Leicester Corporation, being there present the 6th day of October 1672, being Sunday. I begin with Bunyan's interesting appearance in Leicester on the 6th of October 1672 because of the document, a very short memorandum. Without my glasses, I'm struggling to see it, but that's what it looks like. A very short note held in the Leicestershire Archives in Leicester that bears witness to the occasion that I've just described. What I'm interested in is the wording of this document, which accounts for Bunyan in a way that may sound rather interesting, but also rather puzzling to many. For it confirms very clearly that John Bunyan's license authorised him to teach specifically as a congregational person, being of that persuasion. Curious words, these. Congregational person. We might smile at some Victorian transcriptions of the Leicester Note, which we see before us, which mistakenly and repeatedly would transform Bunyan into a congregational parson rather than person. And if it were possible, you'd see, because it's a scribal abbreviation, it appears as Peason, but it was mistranscribed for many years as parson. Parson Bunyan somehow doesn't quite have the right ring to it. He's not a character we'd expect to find sitting around the polite dining tables of a Jane Austen novel. John Bunyan, congregational person, by contrast, is a much more serious proposition and indeed a problem. Given that the widest spectrum of authorities imaginable, historians and literary critics, editors and biographers, theologians and pastors far and wide, past and present, have long agreed that John Bunyan was a particular Calvinistic Baptist, Bunyan's identity as such, as a Baptist, has become nothing less than a truth almost universally acknowledged. Had to get some Jane Austen in there. We have a right to wonder then what Bunyan was doing, what on earth he was doing, presenting himself as a congregational person in 1672. Could this have been a mistake? A misunderstanding of some sort? And our answer, of course, to these questions must firmly be no. Bunyan's choice of terminology when applying for and subsequently displaying his license to minister the word in 1672 was neither denominationally confused nor historically accidental. Having had above 11 years' imprisonment to weigh the grounds and foundations of those principles for which I thus have suffered, having in cool blood 1,000 times by the word of God examined them and found them good during his almost 12 years in prison, as Bunyan states in the preface to A Confession of My Faith and a Reason of My Practice, a short work published in 1672, same year. It is hard to imagine that such a precise and conscientious thinker as Bunyan would have intended to use anything other than the word that appears on his license, congregational. It's the word that he applied on his own license application, and he acted as an agent to others for their licenses at this time within the Bedford church. If Bunyan were a Baptist, why not present himself along with 200 other Baptists issued with licenses in 1672? Why not present himself as such? Might his controversial spat with so-called other or fellow Baptists at this time, we're going to say more about his controversy with Baptists in the early 1670s, might that have prevented him from adopting, officially at least, the name Baptist? Or should the wording of Bunyan's license be explained on the grounds that sectarian identities were supposedly so fluid at this point in dissenting history, the mid to late 17th century, that Congregational and Baptist were, in effect, the same thing? A very popular argument, that. Again, the answer would be no, not least because the communion controversy, in which Bunyan became so embroiled with Baptists in the 1670s, would underscore the well-established distinctions, rival ecclesiastical programs, as Joel Halcombe describes them, that had developed arguably long before the 1670s between the brethren of the baptized way, as Bunyan terms them, and those of the congregational way. Why then would we not take congregational seriously as an intended marker of Bunyan's denominational character? His persuasion. To return to this question is, I'm afraid, to step squarely, some might say bravely, others very foolishly, into the path of a controversy that has rumbled and blustered since the publication of John Brown's, that is the former pastor here at Bunyan Meeting in the late 19th century. John Brown's remarkable biography of John Bunyan, published in 1885, that is almost a century and a half ago. The controversy is, do we see Bunyan as a Baptist or as congregational, or, as some have proposed, something else altogether? Without wishing to call down the full fury of this particular tempest, still, it's the aim of this lecture to give Bunyan his due. And as perhaps only a handful of scholars have done so far, to take seriously and in an unqualified way Bunyan's claim to the title congregational person. to resolve this case of mistaken identity, that of John Bunyan the Baptist, to re-establish the argument for John Bunyan, congregational person, one of the 17th century's congregational men, as Geoffrey Nuttall describes him. We have much work to do. It's late in the day on a dark Thursday night in November. I'm going to try and keep you awake for the next 40 minutes with the tale I have to tell. John Bunyan never makes it easy, of course, for us to attach to him any denominational label. He deplored, famously, those factious titles that marked needless division between godly nonconformists worshipping variously, as he lists them, as Anabaptists, Independents, Presbyterians, or the like, wishing instead to be called a Christian, a believer, or other such name, as Bunyan puts it, which is approved by the Holy Ghost. And in this respect, Bunyan shared something with his contemporary Richard Baxter, who too preferred to be known as a Christian, a mere Christian, of no other religion. Yet, just as Richard Baxter, the mere Christian, would place himself under the self-devised denominationally eclectic category, something of a portmanteau, Episcopal, Presbyterian, Independent, three names all linked by hyphens. Bunyan's rejection of any name other than that of a Christian, his preferred name, is complicated. He may have identified himself in 1672 as Congregational, but on one other occasion at least, he states that he also went by the name Anabaptist. Bunyan the mere Christian, Bunyan the congregational person, Bunyan the Anabaptist. What to do? Setting aside for a moment, we'll come back to it, Bunyan's admission that the name Anabaptist is one that I go under myself, a singular statement, it should be noted, that appeared posthumously with the publication of The Heavenly Footman in 1698. The Heavenly Footman, I don't know if anyone knows that remarkable little book, it's wonderful. Often thought to be the inspiration, the book that Bunyan was writing about the way and race of saints when he took up the pen to write The Pilgrim's Progress. First published only posthumously in 1698. Despite that statement that Anabaptist is a name that I go under myself, nevertheless it is only by way of Bunyan's approach to the question of baptism that we can begin to untangle the complications surrounding his ecclesiological character. For it is in Bunyan's view of baptism that the trouble over his denominational identity properly begins. It is well known that Bunyan held that baptism should rightly be administered to believing adults by immersion, rather than to infants, typically by effusion or aspersion, pouring or sprinkling. Yet, despite maintaining an anti-pedo-Baptist conviction, an opinion seemingly identical to that of the brethren of the baptized way, Bunyan's phrase, nevertheless he distinguished himself from them quite categorically by refusing, so a very familiar formula goes in Bunyan studies, by refusing to make believers' baptism a requirement for membership here at Bedford. He refused to make believers' baptism a requirement for membership. For this reason, Bunyan has been described variously as a mild Baptist, one of the moderate sort. These are all quotations from scholars, biographers, from John Brown in the 1880s onwards to the present day. One of the moderate sort, a baptized independent and an independent Baptist, a quasi-Baptist or Congregationalist, and as Michael Haykin has recently proposed, a Congregationalist, but who favoured believers' baptism rather than a big B Baptist. So, a Baptist, but with a small b, presumably. The most common adjective, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, the most common adjective used to account for Bunyan the Baptist is open. Bunyan, as we are so often told by Michael Haykin, among many others, is allegedly, I hasten to add, a Baptist of the open communion as opposed to the strict or closed communion kind. That is, visible saints could worship and commune at Bedford if willing to deliver before the congregation, as John Bunyan puts it, a faithful relation or discovery of experience, a confession of faith and holiness, with a declaration of willingness to remain subject to the laws and government of Christ in his church. No believer's baptism necessary. Qualifying paedo-Baptists welcome. Yet despite its sheer longevity, having been in circulation for over 2.5 centuries, the identification of Bunyan and this church as open communion, or just open Baptist, as some call it, is far from unproblematic. The most obvious drawback being its anachronism. Neither Bunyan nor his Baptist opponents in the 1670s would have recognised or understood, used or accepted the terms open and closed communion. They did not exist in Bunyan's time as qualifying descriptors of Christian church practice, Baptist or otherwise. Many of you will know that the terms open and closed Baptist, closed communion, open and closed communion Baptist, first appeared in the 18th and 19th century Baptist controversies. The Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, cites its first appearance in the 1790s, but it actually appears earlier in the 18th century than that. First appears in 18th and 19th century Baptist controversy when the likes of William Eltringham and John Brine in the 1750s, Daniel Turner, John Collett Ryland, John Brown, William Butfield and Abraham Booth, all in the 1770s, and then Robert Hall and Joseph Kinghorn in the 1810s, locked horns over whether particular Baptist congregations might or should open their communion tables to those that had not undergone believers' baptism. What emerged from these later contests was a novel terminology. Baptists from this point on might describe one another, not always in a friendly way, as either free or open, promiscuous or liberal, strict or closed. What also emerged at this point was a potent myth that John Bunyan, as a Baptist, I add allegedly, innovated the practice that would become widely known among Baptists of the 18th century as free or open communion. Because he refused, it seemed, to make credo baptism a requirement of communicant membership. By the late 18th century then, Bunyan came to be seen as an early adopter, as we might refer to it now, or a pioneer indeed of this later liberal or free open communion Baptist stance, prompting Grantham Killingworth, great name, Grantham Killingworth, who was a religious controversialist and grandson of the 17th century General Baptist preacher Thomas Grantham. Grantham Killingworth was prompted to declare in 1752 that it was John Bunyan, I believe, who first tried the experiment of promiscuous communion, albeit with terrible consequences for the Bedford church. Bunyan himself, as I have been informed, writes Killingworth, lived to see his error and lamented his conduct therein before he died. For so many paedo-Baptists had been admitted by him that the majority of his church were unbaptized, and after his demise, having chosen an independent for their minister, they gradually became and still remain a paedo-Baptist congregation. Baptists, be warned. Although Bunyan was indeed succeeded by a paedo-Baptist pastor, Ebenezer Chandler, as Chris has already mentioned his name, about whom more will be said anon. This cautionary history of the Bedford church, given to us by Grantham Killingworth in the mid-1750s, mid-18th century, is of course entirely spurious. Nevertheless, Killingworth sounds the alarm clearly enough for Baptists. Disaster awaits what in 1778 Abraham Booth would likewise term in his Apology for Baptists of 1778. You'll have to take my word for it. That's what it says. Would likewise term with deep disapproval Bunyan's bold innovation. Bunyan being one of the first, according to Booth, who dared to assert that the want of baptism is no bar to communion, and who zealously pleaded the cause of free communion when it was yet in its infancy. Assigning to Bunyan the title Open Communion Baptist, then, is a problem, arising from disputes conducted long after Bunyan's era, with Bunyan's prestigious name, indeed his ghost, as Peter Naylor puts it, being dragged into the controversy respectively. Bunyan could be deemed Open Communion Baptist only by undergoing a thoroughly 18th century makeover, attributing to him an identity, a name that he would not have understood and he would certainly have refuted. Yet in continuing to apply to Bunyan the anachronistic descriptor Open Communion Baptist, a dual category error is perpetuated, for the term Open Communion assumes almost axiomatically a Baptist identity, stemming as it does from a very specific and still ongoing debate about whether the Baptist communion table should remain open or closed. Moreover, attaching this label to Bunyan sustains the mistaken presumption that when Bunyan engaged in the communion controversy of the early 1670s, that is, he argued about who was permitted to be admitted to the communion table, he was engaged in controversy with particular Baptists, William Kiffin, Thomas Paul, and Henry Danvers, as well as a general Baptist, John Donne. When he engaged in that controversy in the early 1670s, the mistake is that, the assumption is that he did so as one Baptist of the open communion kind, contending with others of the strict or closed communion type, as would be the case from the late 18th century on. But neither of those propositions should be accepted as accurate. For the fact remains that although Bunyan shared with, and it's his phrase, those called Baptists, a judgment over how the ordinance should be administered, the baptized way was neither his way nor the way of the Bedford church. And his communion tracts of the early 1670s, beginning with a confession of my faith and a reason of my practice, makes this point repeatedly and with patent clarity. I shut none of the brethren out of the churches, Bunyan declares, nor forbid them that would receive them. I am for communion with saints because they are saints. Bunyan is able to issue this famous, and one might say famously congregational clarion call, being a sum of the congregational way's own distinctive, as Geoffrey Nuttall has shown in his still unparalleled book, Visible Saints. Not because Bunyan was an open Baptist, but because he defined church communion in a way entirely at odds with the distinctly Baptist practice of compelling believers to undergo baptism by immersion in order to be admitted to the Lord's table. For Bunyan, only the inward baptism of conversion, demonstrable by the word of faith and good works, moral duties gospelized, as Bunyan puts it, a very beautiful phrase, and by the grace and holiness of the believer would serve, only these would serve as the initiating or entering ordinance to a church communion with those that are visible saints by calling. So in the communion controversy of the 1670s, Bunyan versus particular and general Baptists, Bunyan was not arguing for a modification of what he terms rigid Baptist practice from within the Baptist fold in the style of Turner, Ryland, Brown, Robinson and others a century later. Rather, Bunyan was speaking from and for an ecclesiological position distinct from the baptized way, one that refused outright the Baptist distinctive of necessarily immersing visible saints on admission to a Church of Christ. The near constant attribution to Bunyan of the name Open Communion Baptist over the last 250 years has obscured this point, making it all the more difficult to see the character of Bunyan's practice as congregational, that is, being for union, concord, and communion with saints, as Bunyan puts it. To perceive more clearly John Bunyan's credentials as a congregational person, and what exactly distinguishes him from an Open Communion Baptist of the later 18th century kind, we must pay closer attention yet to what water baptism actually meant to Bunyan. I should point out at this point that most arguments and debates about Bunyan as Baptist or not Baptist, especially not Baptist, tend to be entirely negative. They tend to be along the lines of he couldn't have been Baptist because of this or this or this, but very little is ever said for John Bunyan, the Congregational, in a positive sense. Why would we see him in these terms? So I hope that what I'm about to say will do justice, in a sense, to the more positive arguments that could be put forward. Well, as we have seen, the typical way of viewing Bunyan's attitude to baptism as a so-called Open Communion Baptist is that though holding to it in his own judgment and opinion, his own light, nevertheless, so the by now very familiar formula goes, he allegedly refused to make believers' baptism a requirement of church membership at Bedford. That phrase that I mentioned earlier, the idea of Bunyan as Open Communion Baptist rests on this idea. He refused to make believers' baptism a requirement. Being allegedly a Baptist prepared to tolerate paedo-Baptists in what has been termed, never by Bunyan, a mixed or open or free communion. Bunyan alleged that mixed in his day was a new name. He didn't recognise it. As you'll know, for Bunyan, a mixed communion was unthinkable because it meant the open, profane, and ungodly worshipping alongside the converted, those who had undergone conversion. Well, this idea that Bunyan tolerated paedo-Baptists, refused to make believers' baptism a requirement of church membership or communion, may be an accurate summary of a stance taken by certain 18th century or even present-day Open Communion Baptists. But it is misleading in relation to Bunyan, for the simple reason that it is not the case that Bunyan simply refused to make believers' baptism a requirement of church membership. The very phrasing of which assumes, in the 18th century tradition, sometimes even referred to as the Bunyan tradition, that the Bedford Church was in essence Baptist, and that it practiced believers' baptism as the norm, but allowed some in, occasionally, who for reasons of conscience, wouldn't undergo it. But that's not the case. The sobering fact is that Bunyan made no form or mode of water baptism a term of communion. Though he owned it as a church ordinance, water baptism for Bunyan remained a thing, as he puts it, wholly in itself indifferent to visible sainthood and to the functional life and worship of a Church of Christ. A thing indifferent. And such a stance makes water baptism in any form not just a low thing, as Bunyan avowed, but as he puts it elsewhere, hardly anything at all. As the particular Baptist Thomas Paul and the General Baptist John Donne both reacted in horror Bunyan's judgment regarding baptism as something indifferent turned a holy ordinance into an almost nothing, and indeed nothing, in which case John then asks, where are we now? Where are we now? Quite the question. Bunyan's indifference towards any outward form of baptism as a term of communion and church membership is vital for us to acknowledge and indeed for us to absorb, because it underscores precisely how far Bunyan's practice stood from that of the brethren of the baptized way in the 17th century and that of any open communion Baptists identifying as such from the 18th century onwards, pushing as it does to a much more heterodox position, one that makes the imposition of water baptism on the saints a mere human invention, as Bunyan puts it, an error not founded upon the word, but a mere human device, any pressing of which upon the church is rather like the prayer book, one might think, to no purpose at all for Bunyan. Of course, holding water baptism as a thing wholly indifferent to the identity of both a true Christian and a true Church of Christ would offer Bunyan pastorally a means of preserving unity and love among saints of varying judgments, whose uncomfortable differences might otherwise beget contentions, as Bunyan puts it, that could destroy the house of God. Water alone, Bunyan famously pleaded, should never become a wall of division between the holy and the holy. Yet such a stance offered Bunyan a further practical advantage pastorally. For if water baptism were to trouble the peace and wound the consciences of the godly, he writes, or threaten to dismember and break their fellowship, then, although an ordinance, it is for the present to be prudently shunned, for the edification of the church is to be preferred before it. Better, therefore, Bunyan advises, to suspend his word, suspend baptism, but for a season, to avoid hurting those whose light cannot bear it, and to preserve the amity and concord of the fellowship. And it is precisely this policy of suspending baptism, of being prepared to set it aside altogether as a thing in itself indifferent, indeed to welcome to the Lord's table those who had undergone no outward form of baptism at all, potentially. It is that policy, that conviction upon which Baptists, both particular and general, pounced in the 1670s. As the particular Baptists Henry Danvers and William Kiffin pointed out, some form of baptism as a ritual admission had always obtained an universal consent in Christian worship, while remaining common, as Kiffin puts it, to all Christians in all ages. As such, it is Bunyan's singularity that baffles them, and his singularity in the matter of baptism, it being no matter to communion, left him contrary to almost all Christians, they argued, and perverse in his explosion of the holy ordinance of baptism, becoming indeed an anti-Baptist, according to the General Baptist John Donne, and certainly no better than those persons against whom he, Bunyan, hath so frequently manifested inveterate hatred. I don't know if you can guess who those persons that Bunyan held he controverted with them in his early career. Quakers. Because, the Baptists in the Baptist controversy accused Bunyan, because of his policy of indifference, as being no better than a Quaker. Bunyan's practice left him at loggerheads, not just with the Baptist, general and particular, but as his opponent, particular Baptist opponent Thomas Paul averred, the Episcopal, Presbyterian, and independent, who are all on our side. For our practice, Thomas Paul could declare, though they differ with us about the subject of baptism, who would be baptized. Although they missed the right subject of baptism, even Roman Catholics, am I allowed to say that word? Only joke. I was brought up Roman Catholic, so even Roman Catholics and the Church of England, are we allowed to say no? Kept up the practice of, and this is William Kiffin, kept up a practice of that name, i.e. baptism, in its due rank and order in the church. What Bunyan practiced, by contrast, was sheer anarchy, William Kiffin argued. And as Abraham Booth, in his Apology for Baptists, 1778, over a century later, would conclude, John Bunyan's utterly degrading and irreverent language when speaking of baptism argues for no open or free communion, but rather for a rank catabaptism, capital K, exclamation mark. Catabaptism coming from against baptism, the heresy. And that alone relegated him in Booth's eyes, even though Booth recognised Bunyan as the ingenious author of the Pilgrim's Progress, relegated Bunyan to the lowest company, not only of ancient heretics, but worse, Quakers and Socinians. What the 18th century Baptists, John Bryan and Abraham Booth, recognised in the late 18th century is very clear. Bunyan was no Baptist, either open or closed, but something else, altogether more radical. Well, where are we now? Neither Baptist nor Open Communion Baptist will serve, I would say, as names to describe Bunyan. But the word that appears on his 1672 license does. Congregational. For as Geoffrey Nuttall reminds us, it was far from unusual for church members differing in their judgments over baptism to worship and commune together in the congregational way, with Bunyan standing on what Nuttall would term the more enthusiastic or extremist arm or left wing of the wider 17th century congregational movement. To appreciate fully, however, the vividly congregational character of Bunyan's communion policy, indeed his churchmanship in general, we need only consider some other cases indicative of the practices and principles that Bunyan clearly inherited from and also shared with his congregational peers, including the belief that baptism was a matter utterly indifferent to one's status as a Christian and irrelevant to one's membership of a society of saints. And we can begin with a salient example. Let's hope this works. Here we go. In an earlier and similar, yet also much more localized controversy over exactly the same problem, the terms of baptism and communion, Zachariah Crofton, the Presbyterian curate at St. Botolph's, Aldgate in London, published The Virtue and Value of Baptism in 1658. And he did so in response to a sermon delivered at the church on the 2nd of September 1657 by John Simpson, the religious radical usually described as a fifth monarchist, who also held a lectureship at St. Botolph's while leading a gathered church at All Hallows the Great in London. In this sermon on the 2nd of September 1657, Simpson is alleged to have dismissed not only infant baptism, but baptism of any kind as necessary for communion. Starting to sound familiar? As Crofton summarises, Simpson had promoted in this sermon a baptism degrading notion, viz. Baptism is not the ground of communion with the church, but real grace. And though a man were altogether ignorant of the doctrine and had never passed under water baptism, he, Simpson, could own him as a member of the church and give him all the ordinances of Jesus Christ. Crofton's The Virtue and Value of Baptism was issued specifically to supply an antidote. I don't know if you can see this on the title page, an antidote to the baptism-despising dictates of the baptism-blaspheming Simpson. Crofton and Simpson really didn't like one another. They had lots of arguments. Crofton wanted him out of St. Botolph's for lots of reasons, and this being just one of them. Simpson being a man who preached nullifying notions of God's ordinance. We can perceive clear parallels here with Bunyan's communion controversy with the Baptists some 15 years later in the early 1670s. For Zachary Crofton's objection is not just to John Simpson's anti-pedobaptism, his alleged mocking of baby sprinkling, clearly a phrase designed to really upset, really crank up the tension between him and Crofton. But also to his baptism-annihilating notions, making of baptism an adiaphoron. Simpson is said to have proclaimed that water baptism, the very ordinance itself, to be nothing worth, and the Spirit inward grace to be all in all, even unto communion with the church visible. So for Crofton, as for Kiffin and others in Bunyan's case, the problem was simple. The idea that I may live and die in communion with the body of Christ all my days and yet never know the doctrine, nor pass under the ordinance of water baptism, 'tis the belief of an heretic. John Simpson's congregational anabaptistical, these are Crofton's terms, insistence on baptism as fundamentally irrelevant to Christian communion, an adiaphoron, as Crofton terms it, and upon grace as the sole qualification required of saints, is of course precisely the position that Bunyan would propound and defend in A Confession of My Faith and A Reason of My Practice, 1672, and which he would reiterate in his subsequent communion tracts, Differences in Judgment About Water Baptism, No Bar to Communion, very long title, 1673, and A Peaceable Principles and True of 1674. It is also the stance promoted by William Dell, rector at Yeldon, Bedfordshire, and also from 1649 to 1660, master of Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. Some 25 years before Bunyan's tracts appeared, in 1648, Dell published The Doctrine of Baptisms, arguing that by contrast to the extremely mistaken doctrine of those Anabaptists, as Dell names them, a true fellowship of saints is determined by the grace given to believers, and that alone qualifies them presently to fall into one communion without any more ado, all other outward things being empty forms and shadows, remaining entirely indifferent to them. This is also the position taken by one of the most influential facilitators of the Congregational way in the 17th century, Henry Jesse. Where is matter and form, Henry Jesse states, there is a true church. The matter is to be saints visibly, the form a gathering of these out from the world and joining of them together to worship the Lord in truth. Baptism, Jesse affirms, is not the form. He wrote this in advice, famously in advice to a church he published his advice to churches that he obviously was giving in the late 1640s in A Storehouse of Conscience, first published in 1650. Well, the naming of these congregational men, John Simpson, William Dell, Henry Jesse as examples by which to compare Bunyan is, as I'm sure you've guessed, far from random or accidental. The gathered church in London that John Simpson led as pastor at All Hallows the Great was in fact just one of several congregational societies to which the Bedford Church would dismiss, i.e. transfer, members, and to which the Bedford Church would turn. The Bedford Church would turn to John Simpson's congregation for advice when facing various kinds of troubles in the late 1650s, including trouble over a man called John Child, but also when their second pastor, John Burton, was through weakness unable to perform his duties as pastor anymore. They turned for advice to John Simpson. His was one of the London churches that the Bedford Church would consult for advice. Others named in the Bedford Church book as either having been approached for help or advice, or because Bedford Church members would transfer to their congregations when moving to London, for instance, include those of Henry Jesse, George Cockayne, John Rogers, George Griffith, and of course, the great John Owen. More locally, churches would include those of Francis Holcroft in Cambridge, John Dunn and William Wheeler of Purton Hall and Cranfield, respectively, in Bedfordshire, and John Gibbs of Newport Pagnell, Buckinghamshire, all congregational men with whose churches the Bedford congregation identified closely in its principles and its practices. William Dell invited John Bunyan, controversially, it didn't go down well with parishioners, to preach a sermon at Yeldon, Bedfordshire, on Christmas Day 1659, and has long been recognised as having had a key influence, a key role to play in the development of Bunyan's theological and ecclesiological thought. And even following his death in 1663, Henry Jesse would continue to prove a crucial ally in Bunyan's contest with the Baptists in the 1670s. When the sober Dr. Owen, John Owen, failed to supply John Bunyan with a statement of support amid the escalating communion controversy of the early 1670s, a controversy that just wouldn't quieten down, Bunyan met providentially with a previously unpublished opinion of Mr. Henry Jesse, whose judgment upon the same argument, that is, baptism, Bunyan subsequently appended to his differences in judgment about water baptism, no obstacle to communion, differences in judgment. If one were to judge Bunyan and the Bedford Church by the company they kept, as my late mother-in-law used to say, show me your friends and I'll tell you what you are. If we were to judge Bunyan and the Bedford Church by the company they kept, it would be difficult to avoid the conclusion that they were indeed all congregational. Their consociative ecclesial networks boasting some of the most prominent, important, and also radical 17th century congregational men. By contrast, no Baptist congregations or their ministers feature in the minutes of the Bedford Church book. No, in Bunyan's time, or indeed thereafter, no church member at Bedford was ever dismissed to any church that did not maintain the good old principle, as is inscribed in the church book, of holding communion with saints as saints, though differing in judgment about water baptism. Yet, the decisive influence to bear upon John Bunyan, to quote Geoffrey Nuttall, was that of the Bedford congregation's first pastor, John Gifford. Where lie John Gifford's congregational credentials? Well, in addition to recounting how, as a former Royalist army officer, John Gifford came to Bedford, underwent conversion, and eventually was appointed the church's first pastor, the Bedford Church Book's prefatory materials, and this is the, I still think, rather beautiful front page of the church book on display in the Bunyan Museum. Worth every penny, the admission fee, just to see. It still is on display, is it, Chris? Yeah. still on display here. In the prefatory material of the Bedford Church Book, you will find John Gifford's valedictory letter to the congregation, penned or perhaps dictated just before his death in 1655, while he was fetching his last breath, as it is very touchingly described. And what this final pastoral epistle makes clear is that differences in judgment about baptism, and this is John Gifford's letter, differences in judgment about baptism, laying on of hands, anointing with oil, psalms, or any externals, should never be allowed to result in disputes which gender to strifes, doubtful disputations, or separation from the church. Nor should they prevent anyone from joining. The only expedient, Gifford counsels, regarding admission of members is that having first been satisfied in the work of grace in the party you are to join with, the said party do solemnly declare before some of the church at least, that union with Christ is the foundation of all saints' communion, and not any ordinances or judgment or opinion about externals. Baptism of any kind is no requirement. Union with Christ is the foundation of all saints' communion. Members of the Bedford Church, present and future, would commit to this fundamental tenet, iterated by Gifford on his deathbed, that through grace they will walk in love with the church, though there should happen any difference in judgment about other things. John Gifford, then, must also be considered one of Nuttall's congregational men. Yet we need not read even as far as his valedictory letter to encounter in the Bedford Church Book confirmation of the basis on which the congregation came to be established in 1650. For the Church Book's prefatory history, and if you're not familiar with this, before you even get into the minutes of the Church Book, before you get to Gifford's valedictory letter to the church, his pastoral advice, we have a short history of the Bedford Church. It's fascinating. And in that history, the writer, the anonymous writer, the author, recalls how at its very beginning, the manner in which the 12 holy brethren and sisters who began this holy work of embodying at first did so, upon the principle of faith in Christ and holiness of faith, without respect to this or that circumstance, or opinion in outward and circumstantial things. If all of this sounds like a church following the congregational way, then that is because that is precisely what it is. For as the Bedford Church Book's prefatory history indicates, John Gifford's conviction towards gathering a congregation at Bedford came to him after having continued preaching a while in the town, and then, crucially, after receiving some light into the congregational way. At that point, Gifford moved to gather into gospel fellowship the saints and brethren in and about this town according to that godly order, wherein they determined to walk together in the fellowship of the gospel, a godly people of the congregational way in and about Bedford. Of course, over the following 50 years, by 1700 at least, the strength and durability of the Bedford congregation's fellowship, the unity based on these principles, would be stress tested at key moments over circumstantial and external matters. The issue of baptism stepping to the forefront of internal tensions at times, and no more obviously so than with the appointment of this man. Have you been looking at this portrait today, or is it in the...
It's been mentioned.
Yeah. This is he, the man of the powdered wig, as Chris has described him. This is Ebenezer Chandler, John Bunyan's successor as pastor. He was appointed officially in 1691. John Bunyan died, of course, in August 1688. Ebenezer Chandler was very different from John Bunyan. He was learned, he was educated alongside Edmund Calamy, very interestingly. He was a Presbyterian-friendly paedo-Baptist, hailing from the right wing of the Congregational spectrum, shall we say. Chandler's credentials as a Congregational minister were impeccable. Coming to the Bedford Church through the assistance of George Cockayne, the man who wrote the preface to Bunyan's last published work, The Acceptable Sacrifice. Coming from the meeting in Little Moorfields, London, led by the Congregational minister Richard Taylor, both Cockayne and Taylor being involved in the Congregational Presbyterian Fund and the Happy Union. Quite unlike his predecessor Bunyan, Chandler appears to have been uninterested in appeasing any in the congregation by suspending. Now, this business of suspending one's practice to preserve the light, the conscience of anyone uncomfortable with it. He refused to do this, writing some 10 months before he was elected and set apart to the work and office of pastor on the 18th of December 1691, Chandler would declare, "I have my liberty to baptize infants without making it my business to promote it amongst others, and every member to have his liberty in believers' baptism, only," he adds, "to forbear discourse and debates on it that may have a tendency to break the peace of the church." Chandler could insist on exercising his liberty to baptize infants on the congregational authority of John Bunyan and John Gifford, for we do not design to make baptism, whether of believers or infants, any bar to communion. The Bedford congregation did not break into pieces under the infant baptizing Chandler. The congregational way held strong. It remains baffling, impossible for me to imagine then how a church so long considered Baptist, this church, could also have welcomed as its pastor in 1691 a paedo-Baptist who not only insisted on baby sprinkling, to borrow John Simpson's rather derogatory term, but also who refused outright, doesn't end there, Chandler refused outright to administer believers' baptism. An administrator had to be appointed to perform that duty here at Bedford in his stead. What Baptist church, open or otherwise, would ever tolerate that? Chandler's arrival at Bedford adds then to the already heavily weighted congregational side of the debate of over Bunyan's denomination, to which other kinds of evidence, which we won't go into, both positive and negative, could be loaded. Yet in the opposing balance, there remains a significant and for some apparently definitive counterweight. As mentioned earlier, in his posthumously published Heavenly Footman, Bunyan detonates a denominational bombshell. When warning his reader to beware of religious factionalism when seeking the right way of Christ, here is one runs a quaking, he says. Another for the baptism, another for the presbytery, and yet possibly most of all these sects run quite the wrong way, he says. In saying this, he repeats his caution to have a care of Quakers, ranters, and free willers, but then adds something surprising. Also, do not have too much company with some Anabaptists, though I go under that name myself. For some, this statement alone provides the plainest evidence imaginable that regardless of what appeared on Bunyan's license to preach in 1672, he was, in fact, a Baptist. Of course, it's more complicated than that. After all, when in 1669 the episcopal return of nonconformists surveyed the leaders of the Bedford Church, Bunyan was in prison at that point, it categorised them all as Anabaptists of the meanest sort. But meaning or implying what? Something dangerously radical, presumably. The Anabaptist Munster uprising of the 1530s had not been forgotten, even during the Restoration, making the name Anabaptist a stain, a calumny, with which many different types of dissenter could be easily branded. Yet it's also worth bearing in mind that the meanings of Anabaptists varied even among, the word Anabaptist varied even among dissenters. William Dell, we've seen, referred to Anabaptists as Bunyan would refer to the brethren of the baptized way, that is, those who restricted communion to those receiving believers' baptism by immersion upon confession of faith. For others, Anabaptists could encompass something different, serving as John Coffey has reminded us in his Congregational lecture a few years ago, along with the term independent, serving as a standard label for followers of the Congregational way. Bunyan's warning then in The Heavenly Footman against some, but presumably not all, Anabaptists reflects this complexity. Some Anabaptists Bunyan links to the extreme sects, Quakers, Ranters, Free Willers. But as one that went under that name himself, there appears to be another type of Anabaptist, distinct from the other sort, with whom to spend some time and company, to be in the company of whom wouldn't be so dangerous. For Bunyan, in other words, it seems too that there were Anabaptists and Anabaptists, some whose company should be avoided, but others like him, presumably, who might be regarded as safe. Anabaptists, but with a small a, perhaps. A solution to this apparent conundrum of there being for dissenters themselves two different kinds of Anabaptist is offered by one of Bunyan's most well-known contemporaries, whom we have already met, that preeminently sober, middle-way, non-conforming pedo-Baptist minister, Richard Baxter. In his preface to More Proofs of Infant Church Membership of 1675, Bunyan confirms precisely the sense to be inferred from Bunyan's The Heavenly Footman. There are two sorts of men, Baxter writes, called Anabaptists. The one sort are sober, godly Christians who, when they are rebaptized to satisfy their consciences, live among us in Christian love and peace. And I shall be ashamed if I love not them as heartily and own them not as peaceably as any. The other sort hold it unlawful to hold communion with such as are not of their mind and way, and are schismatically troublesome and unquiet. These are they that offend me, and other lovers of peace. It would be among those sober, pious, peaceable, temperate Anabaptists who refused in practice to renounce communion with all others as unbaptized that Baxter would no doubt have placed Bunyan. For in a defence of Christ and free grace of 1690, Baxter would remark that although the by then late John Bunyan had been an unlearned antinomian Anabaptist, yet, abating his separation, I never heard that Bunyan was not an honest godly man, a Christian, who zealously preached but the commonly acknowledged doctrine of Christ's readiness to receive and pardon converted sinners. Praise indeed. And yet a similarly generous assessment of Bunyan's standing among the good Anabaptists would come from the pen of another pedo-Baptist dissenting divine, Obadiah Wills, an Oxford-educated former rector at Alton Barnes, Wiltshire. I feel like I'm just giving you his address there. In his infant baptism, asserted and vindicated by scripture and antiquity, Wills, the preface for which was written by Baxter, Wills describes Bunyan as very different from the likes of the particular Baptists Thomas Paul and William Kiffin, being a more moderate anti-Baptist, that is, for union and communion with saints as saints, being of the same judgment, in fact, as that holy man, Mr. Henry Jesse, of precious memory, in believing that baptism by the Spirit is the sole qualification for communion. This good man, Bunyan, is cited by Obadiah Wills as an authority on how the very principle itself of Anabaptistry is of a dangerous nature, which in that rigidity, as some men hold it, is of such disquieting tendency that, as Mr. Bunyan speaks before, it is not fit for any age or state of the church, for it leads those that practice it, Baptists as some call them, and our opposites love to appropriate the name for themselves, to rent and tear and divide the church in the zeal for their opinion. According to Wills, Bunyan is not one of those that some call Baptists. that Obadiah Wills would write so warmly of Bunyan as one who opposed the inflexible Anabaptists from the congregational position of pursuing union and communion with saints as saints should not astonish us, for in 1672, Obadiah Wills too applied for a license to teach as a congregational person. No doubt one of the infant baptizing, Presbyterian-leaning, right-wing kind, friends with Baxter, yet congregational all the same. No wonder that Obadiah Wills could admire so unreservedly the practices of the anti-pedo-Baptist Mr. Jesse and Mr. Bunyan, being for a large communion with all believers as believers. Oh, if only there were more anti-pedo-Baptists as these, says Wills. High praise once again, this time from one congregational person to another. Anabaptist, then, was a name that could signal a persuasion very different from those brethren of the baptized way, standing within, having a place within the wider spectrum of the congregational way. We should no longer be led astray, in other words, by John Bunyan's profoundly hesitant and complex, one-time only self-identification as an Anabaptist in the posthumously published Heavenly Footman. It does not supply the incontrovertible evidence, the proverbial smoking gun required to fix Bunyan to an allegedly Baptist identity. Instead, I think we can and should accept more confidently what his 1672 license to preach, his writings on the church and the Bedford Church Book, the Bedford Church's relationships with other churches, among many other sources, all confirm that John Bunyan was a congregational person, ministering to a church founded here in Bedford in 1650 on the principles of the congregational way, both pastor and people being and remaining of that persuasion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Michael. Do we have any questions, comments? Over here to begin, and we'll use the microphone and everyone can hear.
Yes, I've got something with them. Thank you very much, Michael, for your lecture. The one thing that concerns me as a Baptist is this. The thing that comes first is faith.
Yes.
And in the classic case of the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip, after he has received faith, he says, "Here is water. Why may I not be baptized?" And I wonder, you see, these words like pedo-Baptist, anti-pedo-Baptist, really have very little significance except in the matter of faith, of saving faith. Here's faith, be baptized. Or don't be baptized. People of similar faith. In Welsh we call it cyfeilib ffydd. And those are acceptable to everybody.
Bunyan would agree, without doubt. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. Two questions. One is, he's referred to as an Anabaptist, or he says he's an Anabaptist, in a posthumous publication. Did he actually write that, or was an editor involved?
Well, I've never thought of that question before. As far as we know, I mean, the publisher was Charles Doe, who oversaw the publication in 1692 of the folio, the first volume of what was to be a or at least two-volume collection of Bunyan's work. So we'll take it on faith that he said that. That isn't an interpolation, as it were, by Charles Doe. What prompts you to ask that question?
everything that you'd said previously suggested that he wouldn't have described himself that way. So is it someone an editor reading back his ideas about what Bunyan should have been? And my other point was concerning the use of the word Anabaptist, and you mentioned Munster. I'm reminded of an incident many years ago when someone asked me, referring to my wife, is that part of your religious garb, what she was wearing? And we were asked, so are you Christians? Yes. What sort? Real ones? They wanted a label. So eventually I said, we're Anabaptists. Blank expression. But the person next to him said, oh, you've got a lot to live up to. I said, oh, you've heard of them? Yes, they began in 1535 in Munster. And I said, no, it was actually the 21st of January 1525 in Zurich. He said, oh, you obviously know more about them than I do. I've just written a thesis about them for Lancaster University. But I think the problem is that the term in the 16th century was so broad. It was basically, if you weren't Protestant and you weren't Catholic, you were Anabaptist. And there were Anabaptists who were Paedobaptists. They rebaptized their infants because they saw state baptism as a badge of citizenship, which they renounced. And I'm wondering whether that carried on at all into the 17th century England or not. Was it just Anabaptism was seen in 17th century England as being really Baptists and with no relation to the 15th century, apart from using it, Munster, as a state?
As far as I know, that kind of complexity that you're describing, which is fascinating, doesn't carry into the use of the term, the circulation of the term, certainly by the late 17th century, or certainly in Bunyan's world or circles. But John Coffey's very helpfully, I mean, the way that he sees the term being used, or rather to borrow John Coffey's frame for these kinds of things, is that these terms, the word like Anabaptist, how it's being used and how it's understood is dependent upon context, the person who's using it, and the issues that are being described. So when an agent for the Episcopal Survey of 1669 for the Church of England describes Bunyan's church members of Anabaptist, then that might mean something very different for that surveyor from Bunyan saying, even though I go by that name myself. So it's phenomenally complex, but as far as I'm aware, not as complex as the situation that you're describing in that much earlier phase. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It does call into question whether we should be using denominational terms at all. Even the very word denomination seems a bit anachronistic. However, I'm kind of persuaded by what you've said. I'll have to read it and read it with interest. But thank you very much for that. You passed down a lot of names which are all very familiar to me from my PhD. And I remember Zachary Crofton, who was your critic of John Simpson, was lampooned 2 years later in 1660, 1661 as Zachary Knottroff. There were all these plays written about him being naughty with his maids, whether in fact any of that was true or not. But of course he was a good Presbyterian, not a good Congregationalist. And I always saw Simpson as a Congregationalist rather than a fifth monarchist. But there we are. Yeah. You don't mention the fact that Bunyan, that any of these blokes who are all university educated, criticised Bunyan for being a tinker. And then moving on a little bit to the Quakers, whom Baxter is very anti. The Quakers, of course, would claim that they do have the sacraments, ordinances, as you quite properly call them throughout, well done, that actually, but it's an outward sign of an inward grace, and they've got the inward grace. So is that really, in a sense, where you were going? And the Geoffrey Nuttall thing, I mean, Geoffrey wrote works on studies on Christian enthusiasm, using the word enthusiasm, wrote about the last enthusiast, who I think was Hal Harris, from memory. But of course, you've also got, in the 1930s, back to John Brown up there, you've got Monsignor Ronald Knox writing a book on enthusiasm, where he's criticising every Christian breakaway group, whatever you can think of, sectarian group. So, just a few thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, your first point, I think, is certainly something that, writing this lecture, I was wrestling with. You know, I don't like the name denomination. Bunyan doesn't like the name, you know, to name something, to denominate. I really like the idea of persuasion. It suggests, on the one hand, an intellectual position, that one is persuaded, but also that one can change that intellectual position. That's very much, you know, Bunyan's position on all things to do with conscience. But yes, and but I mean, you've said so many things. I'll just take those on board. But yeah, thank you, Alan. Yeah.
Thank you so much. As a point of clarification, you said that Bunyan, in his ministry, was accepting people for the Lord's Supper, whether or not they had been baptized. It was not a bar. Please, can you clarify? Was he saying that it's if you've been baptized as a believer or as an infant, it doesn't matter, you can come to the Lord's Supper? Or is he saying if you've been baptized as a believer or as an infant, or not at all?
The latter.
That's right. Okay.
And that's the problem that Abraham Booth and John Bryan in the 18th century have with it, because the logic of John Bunyan's position is the inward baptism is all, and hence he's accused of being no better than a Quaker, because the inward baptism is all. And that's John Simpson's position too, and that's a view that once you see John Bunyan as an open communion Baptist, then you can't see that anymore. But the logic is, it really doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It's just a thing indifferent in itself.
Please, may I ask a follow-on question? Okay.
Yeah.
In what sense would he bar the table in terms of morality at all, and obedience to Christ? I mean,
yes, I mean very so. The terms rigid and strict and so on. Bunyan saw the Baptists, the Baptist brethren of the Baptist way, as rigid in their church practice. But Baxter saw the independents, those of the independent way, as rigid in their practice. So for Baxter, Bunyan would have been too strict in his criteria, and even though the criteria was that you undergo repentance and conversion, that you offer to the church a confession of your faith and holiness as well as experience, and that you agree to, as it were, the covenant, to obey the laws of the government of the Church of Christ. Other than that, then, as long as you pass that test, you would be welcome. And also that you would certainly not raise disputes. So the church book is full of cases where the church members who are in trouble are those who are raising disputes, who are being disputatious and causing janglings and contentions. So yes, does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Not a quarter of a mile from where you're sitting this evening is a blue plaque which reads, John Bunyan was baptised on this site, circular 1650. And yet, after that date, the church to our left, as we sit here, and to your right, is where his daughter Sarah and final child Joseph were sprinkled as infants. Could that be mystifying?
It has mystified many. I don't know if everyone is aware of the problems or just the issues raised by. Sorry, remind me of your name. John, yes. Thank you, John. So there are two problems which are addressed in the director's cut. I've kept you for long enough already tonight. I know it's a very long lecture. Apologies. There's a lot to say. I hope that hope it makes sense for me to say that. But there are two other issues. One is, so was John Bunyan baptised? And if so, then when? And if so, then why doesn't Bunyan mention it in Grace Abounding? Was he baptised? There's no record of John Bunyan being baptised, but there is a really wonderful account of it, imagined in a biography of Bunyan. I think it's by an American, Robert Phillips. It's referenced in the lecture, the printed version, who imagines the water gleaming off the ooze, like the Jordan, and as Bunyan was plunged by John Gifford, John the Baptist, and the Spirit descends. It's a marvellous piece of writing, but it's entirely without record. So what do we do? Was he or wasn't he? The first person to say that John Bunyan was baptised was Charles Doe, the publisher, and a comb maker too. So who knows? We could assume that he was, but we don't know. We don't know when. We don't know. And then there's Bunyan's children, and this perplexed many, especially in the late 19th century. Did Bunyan have his children baptised? There are records in parish records, including Joseph Bunyan in 1672, 1673, is that right? So the same year that all of this is going on. How do we explain this? It's been explained away by this not being John Bunyan's son, but John Bunyan's grandson, that it's another John Bunyan, the son of John Bunyan, who had Joseph baptised. But it still leaves a question mark over the other children, not that all the children were baptised. So, and that actually is the issue which in the 19th century, the late 19th century, really kick-started the John Bunyan was congregational idea. But I haven't gone into that. If only we had another 4 hours. Yeah. It is fascinating though, isn't it? Yeah.
I read somewhere that it's Doe, and some of the other things he says about Bunyan are quite inaccurate. And this person who was writing on Doe was saying that it's quite possible that this idea of who's baptised as a believer is quite inaccurate, and it's all a myth. But and that would perhaps tie in with the children being baptised. I don't know.
Well, it was John Brown who kind of cited the parish records. It was what do we do now with this information? It's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, Michael, I'll hand over to John Parry, who's going to offer a vote of thanks.
Oh.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. I must remember to thank you first, because otherwise I'll forget, with the responses that come as a result of your fascinating lecture. I'm an imposter here. I am not a church historian. My own field is Indian religions, so forgive me if I respond through the lens of that. But the first thing that struck me, which was fascinating to me, was Booth's Apologies for Baptist was published by the Dilly brothers in the Poultry in London. And what strikes me is that I think there's all sorts of work that needs to be done on the Dilly brothers, who held regular evening conversations with their writers and so on. And it would have been quite remarkable to have listened to the back and forth debate that was going on in Dilly's household. Dilly's were also responsible partly for the publication of William. I never forget William Carey. Of William Carey's book about the necessity of mission. So I find it fascinating to see that link that's going on there, a link of discussion, of search and so on. But for me, what came over very, very strongly was that my mind went immediately 4,000 miles away from here, because at exactly the same time, the Sikh gurus were going through that whole process of questioning labels, of questioning people saying you must be identified as this, that, or the other. And I find it fascinating, a bit like Jasper's work, that there's something going on in so many different places around the same kind of issues. And what struck me was something that you mentioned almost in passing, and that was Simpson and Bunyan's use of that term grace, and that as the dominant, preeminent issue, as being so important as you question the labels. So for me, it's been a fascinating evening. I'm ever so grateful, as indeed all of us are, to you and to this place for offering the hospitality that it has. But to you particularly, Michael, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
There are copies of the lecture available for all friends of the... It's over, isn't it? Too late. There's copies of the lecture available. If you are a friend, do take your copy with you, then it saves postage. If you would like to purchase a copy, they are £3. £3
if they're postage, £1, I think.
So there are copies available tonight if you want a copy.
But they're in the office.
Oh. Well, we can empty one or two envelopes, then refill them again, can't we? So if you want one tonight. So £3 for the lecture. Am I correct on that, Willie?
£3 for taking it tonight.
Yeah, £3 for taking it tonight. And don't forget to take your copy if you are a friend of the Congregational Library. Thank you, everyone.
Just check it out. £3.50.
Special offer.
It's Black Friday tomorrow. So.
Yeah, Black Friday tomorrow.
We've got Natasha, we'd love to join you for dinner, but we've got to get back to Brixton. But thank you very much. I have got a copy of the Heavenly Book. I bought it years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I just bought everything I could have bought.
Yeah.
We'll catch up soon. I'm supposed to be looking at some water parts with you.
Yes.
I'm supposed to be coming here to look at some rare bindings. So tell me when you're
Okay.
around. You know Dr. William time is closed.
No, the last time I spoke to you was obviously here a year ago, and oh no.
It's very sad because all the manuscripts are there. The alarms aren't working. People are sleeping in front of the porch. The newsreaders are saying that he's working hard to get home. I'm so worried about it. There's not anything I'm doing.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear this.
We're still seeing all sorts of good readers at Brixton. We're looking until we get the collection in Cambridge or wherever it goes. So that's okay. But
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I'm
there's so much to, in a collection.
raise money too.
Willie.
There's Willie. We have to empty.
That would be better.
There's all the spare ones are locked away.
I like it. Willie comes along, gives it 4 minutes.
Notice the beautiful types.
Be careful, you've got one of those.
Don't give it to me, give it to Willie.
Nice pen.
Sure, Willie, give it to me. Willie.
Oh, I've missed because I'm doing my own. There's a dot between changes. I'm sorry about that.
Baptist. Kind of here. Yeah, that was one of the places in the world. I thought I could go down there and be anonymous, but no longer.
Okay, yeah, and I'd love to do that. I've looked at now for Tim Cooper, I've looked at all the backs of letters. I've got a real idea of who's using what and what's in use and where it's coming from. And we found some of them mill owners, and now I'm working for Peter Bauer, who's the kind of leading paper forensic man. He's wonderful, bright, but he's quite ill now, so I'm doing some research with him, and which gives me a wider kind of look at 17th century watermarks. So anyone who wants to do watermarks, I'm going to concentrate on that for a while. So.
Well, brilliant. Well, I can't believe it's been over a year since I.
Well, that's life. It goes like that.
But the odd thing is, it hasn't been a week or a month that I haven't thought I've got to email, I've got to do this. But I'm so glad you.
Oh, I'm glad because we found somebody else to do it, but.
No, I haven't.
Okay. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to.
Yeah.
To him.
Nice to see you again. See you in 25 years.